The numbers are probably exaggerated, and they're impossible to check. But whenever exaggerated, they tell something. The label museum started to be in use for a larger range of collectibles without any practical limit. It is now possible to build a museum of anything, or, to put it in more scientific words, to see any kind of object as a possible semiophone, if I follow Pomian's wording in his study of collections and collections. To offer a few examples, right after the industrial landscape had been deserted in those very years, it has been patrimonialized in most of the old industrial countries, from Britain to Germany, to France to the US. More striking and maybe more significant, I think, is the success of the vintage phenomenon, which converts day after day the most recent production, clothes, music, daily objects, into signs or remnants of the past. Note that there is nothing here which is specific to France. We live in society which are more and more addicted to museographic and archival practices. A second consequence is the multiplication and diversification of the actors involved in the patrimonial activity. It is no more limited to a professional body of specialist curators. As initiatives are now decentralized and dispersed, they have been largely reshaped, from which a number of regional and local decision makers are expecting substantial and diverse benefits, political benefits, benefits in terms of identity, and more prosaically, some local valorization or stronger attraction. At many different levels, instances and interests have opted and invested in the making of the patrimony. The usual public institution, but as well local associations, private companies, and more diffusely, a new body of private specialists who promote and sell technical skills and turnkey programs, many of them heavily standardized. The cultural industry is currently taking care of the production of the heritage. The third consequence is a logical follow-up of the first two ones. In the name of the preservation of an heritage, we are confronted with a manifold and proliferating invention of tradition. This new, not really. Cobb's commentaries Stranger have shown that it had a long-lasting existence, that the size and intensity of the patrimonial wave offer new opportunities and the competition is tense among the inventors. As an example, I can give the study made by an ethnologist Jean-Luc Bognol in the Larzac. Larzac is a small area south of the Massif Central, which has been invested with two different sets of past. It has been a place of struggle in the early 1970s. Struggle between the army and local peasants, backed by post-68 activists. It has been as well a place for the underground during the Nazi occupation during World War II. But it needed a longer past, and therefore the story of the Protestant resistance to Louis XIV has been annexed. The Protestant resistance, that is, the Camisards, the first decades of the 18th century, which now would merge with the Maquisards, that is, the undergrounds during World War II. So the past was longer than expected. Larzac has therefore become the symbol of a long-lasting tradition of resistance to the central power, which makes it hard nowadays of José Bové, to give a name. But there is more. Some historical remnants few ruins, a number of toponyms, still attest the presence of the Templars and some hospitals religious order in the Middle Ages. They had nothing to do with each other. But the Templars keep a fascinating story of mystery. A new historical synthesis has therefore been invented, which make it possible to present Larzac to the tourist as the land of Templars and hospitals. This almost desert area has therefore been invested with a dense marking of symbolic, newly invented web of historical places. It's actually even more complicated, as rival political authorities and rival entrepreneurs may want to sell different and competing versions of this task, eventually in the same place. Such a major shift goes along with substantial changes in what is included in the patrimony. For another period, it had been identified with the monuments of culture. It is now associated with a culture in the anthropological sense of the word, that is, with an indefinite collection of anonymous productions for which no special form of legitimation is required. They only have to be authentic, but nobody knows exactly what authenticity means. This collective enthusiasm raises some crucial questions as well. To begin with, if everything matters, what is really important and to whom? This is not only a theoretical, historical, or aesthetical question, as it raises further integration. Under such condition, how is it possible to think a reasoned patrimonial policy in terms of inventory, protection, in terms of choice of programs and preferences? The landscapes appear to be constantly blurred those days. Clamorous disputes have dealt with those topics during the 1990s, most of them boosted by just political afterthoughts. They have denounced the presumption of the cultural state and its failure, and the fact that cultural creators had been substituted with cultural mediators. I don't want to get further into this polemical area, which had shed actually little light on the debate. It remains that it is not illegitimate to ask whether an excess of patrimony is not killing the very idea of patrimony. We may ask as well what is behind this recent patrimonial inflation and its almost obsessive aspects. More than one answer are possible. Let me suggest two of them to conclude my talk. We may certainly think that the claim for a shared past contributes to some kind of self-assertion in terms of identity, another word of the time. We live in mass societies in which individual and collective identities often experienced as being under the threat of anonymity and standardization. Globalization is the most visible objective process at work. It is at the same time a powerful ideological claim for this transformation. Yet, against what globalization says of itself, the process is not linear and it is not univocal. While it bears some obvious aspect of homogenization of practices, representations, and systemic organization, it generates as well significant and sometimes exasperated counter effects and claims for differences. The accelerated invention of patrimonies might be one of those possible answers. While social bounds and their ideological and political expression have turned to be uncertain and questionable, the vague, embracing notion of patrimony offers resources of identification, a sense of belonging to, just as sport events offer it occasionally in a more brief and convulsive way. Patrimony does it in a more constant and familiar way, including many dimensions of social experience, and even its natural dimension, ecological dimension, nowadays. The second line of interpretation, which certainly not exclusively the first one, is a current transformation of our relationship to time, more precisely, to history. I've already mentioned it earlier this term. Our society's trust in the future is significantly lower than it used to be, which may seem paradoxical in a time of spectacular technological and scientific progress at a pace unknown until the past decades, or maybe because of it. For more than 2 centuries, as Ryan Kozelek has shown and also not after, their ability to project themselves in the future has determined the way we use to represent our place in history and the relation between the past, the present, and the future. This is no more the case with the times being. What we have inherited, or more exactly, what we constitute as heritage, appears to be more secure. Is it actually more secure? We capitalize the past, but we're not even sure that our investment will be a lasting and rewarding one, as it appears to be under threat on all sides, as everything is changing so fast around us. Therefore, the sense of emergency. No more nostalgia for the world we have lost, as Peter last night worded it so successfully in the 1960s, but the conviction that the world we're living in is falling apart. From this point of view, the opening of the traditional patrimonial repertory to natural environment is a telling sign. It refers more largely to the fact that time is now a suspicious matter after 2 centuries of dedicated belief in progress and in the sense of history. As we don't trust it anymore, we want to decide ourselves what the future might keep of our present. Everything of it, or at least whatever can be said. Presentism is a current name for a suspended time, that is, a timeless time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions. I'd like to start with something very naive question, but it seems to me that we tend to associate patrimony and memory as substratum to life. So that patrimony is a condition for the elaboration of memory, as feeds memory. And it seems that we were beginning to study by there is a longer trajectory of the notion of patrimony, at least in the French case, since the late 18th century, since the Revolution, and or even before. And so I'm wondering, since we tend also to think that memory is or that the emphasis on memory, the importance of memory, the age of memory is something rather recent, I was wondering if you can, if you're doing that in order to complicate the relationship between patrimony and memory, that you don't, it's not a condition, it's not a substratum for memory, very so you can actually think of a form of patrimoine without memory.
Yeah, you can as well identify forms of memory without it. Alvax certainly doesn't care much about the treatment of the memorial experience within some social frame. So, what I think is that patrimony and memory work parallelly, they certainly have to do with each other, but don't work at the same pace. It's only the thing over the last generation 70s, beginning of the world crisis, this loss of confidence, which is so visible in France and elsewhere, that they both accelerated. Memory being more, I was to say spectacular. I'm not even sure if it's not spectacular, because if you see what really exists and leave traces, patrimony is probably more visible everywhere. The Ministry of Culture devotes a larger part of its activity to the promotion, conservation, and now, because there is no money, announcement.
One comment and one question. I think you may find even before 1789 stirrings of this interest and this opening to the past, because the royal government itself opened the Louvre and opened the library, which we're familiar with from the Rue Richelieu, to the public. And there were public newspaper reports on the exhibitions at the Louvre. And there was also the proposal before 1789 for a new calendar. What was his name? Sylvain Maréchal, who wanted to eliminate the saints' names from the calendar, but to replace that with the heroes from France's past, which is interesting in light of what you've said. My question is, in light of all of this interest on patrimoine historique, why the explosion, even among historians, critical of Sarkozy's suggestion for a museum on the history of France, other than the fact that he wants to take over the Hôtel Soubise, which would be very bad for the archive.
Yeah, the first point, you're right, Vivian. I just think that it is a major change if the public is a collective political being or not. And that happened with the revolution. There is a political dimension to the shift. Now, why is this reaction against the museum? Well, I'm impressed by the fact that most everybody reacted against it, almost independently from any political affiliation. That is, you may expect it from political opponent, but Pierre Nora, who is not typically a political opponent, took the lead against it as well. I think two things there. One is the traditional suspicion of political manipulation after the debate of identity. And the second is that, which is more prosaic, I'm afraid, is that nobody felt that it was necessary, that it would change anything in the way French history might be publicized or communicated or told. So there was no or little conviction among the profession. It made a lot of noise, but I personally see it as an uneven.
I have a question about French history textbooks. So for example, in Terminal this year, high school seniors are learning the historiography on Vichy and on Algeria. So how is it, what is the mechanism by which historians in France decide what a mémoire is going to be and convey to students? And can you consider that mémoire a form of patrimoine?
Well, there are two aspects to the question. There is a body of specialists, les inspecteurs généraux, senior ex-professors who are in charge of the content and the teaching of history, and who elaborate programs. How it works inside that, I don't know. I know everybody knows, but there is certainly a nice sociological work if you are allowed to be part of the committee, to see which kind of arguments those people exchange. And well, not necessarily studies are slow. For what I know, inspection general is now much more aware of the current debates that it used to be in the past. Now means the last 10 years. But this is history, and in a sense assumes that students know more about the Vichy period through TV programs, or films, or less readings probably, than through what they learn at school. There has been a series which is still running, Un Village Français, which is an interesting one, by the way. Which started 3 years ago. Every year you have 1 year of the war time. This is advised by Jean-Pierre Azema, who is one of the leading specialists of the case. And I'm convinced that if teenagers know something on Vichy, it will be through this kind of medium much more than school books. I might be wrong, I might be right. But memory, well, in a sense, here's a process of producing memory works along the same lines as producing patrimoine. And those things have been well studied already by advocates. That is, you appropriate things that you have not necessarily experienced by yourself, but heard of, which is transmitted within your family, professional, religious group, whatever. So there are memories at disposal people identify with. A student of mine has studied how the Nazi period is taught in Germany nowadays, both in ex-West and ex-East Germany. And what is striking is that the teenagers don't know that much and have strong identification with things they don't know about, including people who come from Turkey or Afghanistan. So, whose this past is not there. And this is very parallel, I think, to what I've tried to say in the making of the patrimoine.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk and obviously the history of heritage. I'm more familiar with the contemporary period, but my questions are about the historical one, and it goes a bit in the direction of my first question. I'm wondering what is the benefit of going back to the French Revolution, because I'm wondering, in fact, what are the limits of going back to the French Revolution to think about the beginning of patrimoine in France? And there are several reasons, and one of them is that it presents, in terms of the emergence of collective consciousness, something that seems to me to be the work of a much more limited public, of in particular connoisseurs, collectors, artists who were claiming access and continued access to these huge trove of artworks and of churches, etc., that the revolution, among other political processes, was endangering and dilapidating, tragedizing, etc. So I don't know, maybe it's more of a personal hypothesis, but I was wondering what you thought about that, that there is really at work in the revolution a very peculiar, public, semi-professionalized, very vested, with very vested interest in continued access to these goods, and therefore with vested interest in the state intervention. So that's one reason. Another limit, it seems to me, of going back to the revolution is that history at the time of the revolution is actually a very dominated kind of symbolic resource, and people, so the Commission des Monuments is one thing, but the Commission of the Arts was much more important, it seems to me, from what I've read about the period. And interest in artworks was about art and aesthetics and not about history and aesthetics. So history, it seems to me, doesn't build up strength until 2 or 3 decades into the 19th century. So, yeah, I know, I was wondering about that. And the Musée des Monuments Français was a very small and marginal enterprise at the time that it was undertaken. And then also, going back to the French Revolution, because of our bias as French people, we tend to, go with this mythology, with this nationalist mythology about the democratic origins of everything. And if one looks at the historic preservation and its institutionalization in other countries, for example, in Europe, for example, Sweden has the first edict in the middle of the 18th century protecting churches, and it's connected to the nationalization of churches, to a certain process of confiscation, and to this to this accumulation of certain types of symbolic goods, but not to a democratic enterprise. So it seems to me there's a bit of a bias for these perhaps various reasons into this French point of view on the history of heritage.
I'll try to make my point of view. I never say it was democratic. I never used the word democratic. You use it.
It's a bit connotation of
sorry.
no?
I say it was, first of all, a legal definition, and that I think is extremely important. And second, the people who were in charge of the heritage had a clear consciousness that it now was a bien national, a public good, for a public audience. It's obvious that it doesn't mean that everybody would go to the Louvre or appropriate in a way or another those cultural goods. But the very notion had been crafted at the same time, and that it would be a long-lasting question. So I know nothing on Swedish history. I'm guilty for that. But I don't think that the general phenomenon of secularization is known as desamortización in Spain, etc. Has produced a similar effect. The fact that the public power happened to be in charge of doesn't mean that there is a legal transformation and a different status of a cultural good. The second point, take the Louvre. Well, the conviction that this was the collective property of the French, and because the French were supposed to head the rest of mankind, has made it possible for many years for them to rob art collections throughout Europe and bring them to Paris without any sense of guilt, as Paris now was the center of the world, and there the evidences the human genius should normally be gathered. And this, I think,